In this video, we will discuss about set matrix zeros. So first, let's understand the question. Given an m cross n integer matrix, if an element is 0, set its entire row and column to zeros and you must do it in place. So what they are saying is that in the input, you are given a matrix of size n cross m. Here n and m can be equal or can be unequal. So now what you need to do is that in this matrix, whichever cell is having its value as 0, you need to set its entire row and entire column to 0. Meaning, if this is a 0 here, then its entire column values should become 0. So this one will become 0, this is already 0, this one will become 0. And its entire row as well. So this one will become 0, this one will become 0 and this one will become 0, right? So that's what you need to do. Now the first thought that comes in our mind is that okay, start from the starting, traverse the matrix, and whenever you encounter any 0, just mark its entire column and row as 0, right? But now what is the problem here? When you will mark this entire row as 0 because of this 0, then this one will become 0, right? Now when you will come at this cell, you will see that it is having the value 0, right? So you will say now I should mark this entire column and this entire row as 0 because of this 0. But ideally here 1 was present, and if 1 was present, then that means this entire column should not be updated to 0, right? So this is not the right approach. So let's think of some other approach. So what we'll do is, whenever we find any cell whose value is equals to 0, instead of directly updating its row and column, we will mark it somewhere, right? We will mark it somewhere that okay, when I have found that this cell is 0, then that means I need to update the values of this column and the values of this row to 0. So I will mark this column and this row somewhere, right? So let's suppose I am having an array here, right, which is same as the size of the number of columns, and it is named column. And I am having another array here whose size is same as the number of rows. This is for rows. So let's suppose it is having 1 initially, all the values, right? So what you will do is that whenever you encounter a 0, you will mark its corresponding column and row. So when you will mark all the rows and columns for all the zeros, then you can just traverse in your matrix again, and you can check that if for any particular cell, you can check that if for any particular cell, if either its column or its row is marked as 0, then this particular cell should also be marked as 0, right? So what you will check that if you are at any cell, right, you will check that if its corresponding column or its corresponding row, if any of them is marked as 0, then that means this cell's value should also be marked as 0, right? So but now here we would be creating two arrays, right? So we are not optimal about our space complexity, right? So we should think about some other approach where we can optimize our space complexity, right? So what we'll do is, instead of creating two separate arrays, we will try to utilize this matrix itself, right? So for this row, instead of creating another array and then marking it, can I consider this first column as this rows array, right? So what I'll do is that whenever I want to mark any row as 0 afterwards, like if you will see in this example, for this 0, you need to mark this column and this row as 0, right? So whenever you want to mark a particular row as 0, what we'll do is that whatever is the first element in that row, we will mark it as 0, right? So then this will denote us later on that okay, this row has to be updated to 0 because its first element is equals to 0, right? And similarly for column, we will take the first row, right? We will take the first row. So whenever you are at a cell, you will check that if the first element in this column is 0 or not. If it is, then you need to mark this also as 0, otherwise it will remain as is, right? So what I'm saying is that this rows array will now become this, and this columns array will now become this, right? But now there is one problem over here. What is the problem? That this particular cell is coinciding, right? You cannot store two values here. So if let's suppose due to some 0 you marked this one as 0, so now you don't know that whether this 0 was marked for the row or it was marked for the column, right? So what we'll do is, for the rows we will take this much part only, but for column we will take this much part, right? And for this particular one box we'll create another variable, let's suppose c, and we'll keep its initial value as 1, right? So whenever we want that the first row should be marked as 0, then at that time we will update this cell. And if at any point we want that first column should be marked as 0, then at that time we will update the variable c, right? So this is how we are going to tackle this intersection point. So now what will happen is, when you will be at this cell 0, then you need to mark this and this, right? Because this is the first element in this row and this is the first element in this column, right? So for this 0, you will update this one to 0 and this one to 0, right? Then you will check this is 1, this is 1, this is 1. Now you will check for this 0. Now for this 0, you should mark this column and this row, right? So this column is already 0, you will only mark the row, right? Then you will come at this 0. So for this 0, you should mark this column and this row, right? Row is already 0, only column will be updated. Then you will check this is 1, this is 0. So now for this 0, you need to mark the row as well as column, right? So now for this 0, what is the row? This cell itself, right? So we don't have to update it, it is already 0, right? But now for the column, for this 0, I want that column 0 should be marked, right? So for marking column 0, we had created another variable, right? So we will update it to 0 now, right? Then you will check this is non-zero, this is non-zero, this is non-zero, right? So now you are done with the marking of the rows and columns where the values should be updated to 0. Now what you can do is that you will start traversing in your matrix and you will check that for any particular cell, what is the value in the first element of that column and in the first element of that row. If either of them is 0, then you will update this also to 0, right? And if the cell's value is already 0, then there is no need to check it, right? So if any cell is having a non-zero value, only then you can check it, right? So now if you see here, if you see one case, so when you will be at this particular cell, right? So for this particular cell, what is the row? This cell itself, right? And what is the column? Column is this one, right? Now you see that column is set to 0. The column is marked. Then that means I should update this value to 0, right? So but now when you will update this value to 0, what will happen is, when you will come at this point, for this, what is the column? This cell itself. What is the row? This cell, right? Now you will see that in this cell 0 is present. That means this row is marked. So you will update this one also to 0. But is it correct? Initially in our matrix these were the zeros. So for them these rows should have been marked, right? So this one should remain intact and the others would be marked as 0. But right now if you are marking this as 0 and then for this cell you are checking this cell, then you will update this one also to 0. So this will be wrong, right? So now how are you going to tackle this situation? So what we'll do is that instead of starting from here, we'll start with this element, meaning we will update this much part of the matrix first and then we can come to this row and column, right? So we will basically start from 1 comma 1 and we'll go till n and m, right? So we will update only this much part, right? So you will see that this is already a 0. Now this is a non-zero. For this you will check its corresponding row and column and you see both are zeros. So this will also be updated to 0. Then you will check this is a non-zero. Then you will check its corresponding column, that is also non-zero, but its row is 0. So this will also be updated to 0. This is already 0. This is also already 0. Now this is a non-zero. So you will check its column. So it is 1, but its row is 0. So this will also be updated to 0. Then you will check this. This is already 0. This is a non-zero. Its corresponding column is having a 0. So this will also be updated to 0. Then for this, its corresponding column has been marked. So this will also be moved to 0. Then for this particular one, its corresponding column is not marked, but the row is marked, right? So that's why this will also become 0. So at the end only this one will remain, others all will become 0, right? So at the end you will be sorted with this much part of the array, right? Now at the end you will be sorted with this much part of the matrix. Now we need to update the first row and the first column, right? So now out of these, which one are you going to update the first? The first row or the first column? So if you see that for this particular cell, how should I identify whether should I change it to 0 or not? For this particular cell, what is the row? This, right? And what is the column? This cell itself, right? So then that means the value of this cell depends upon the value of this cell, right? Now if you will check for this cell, what is the row for this cell itself, right? And what is the column? This particular variable. So if you will see that for this particular cell, its value is dependent here. But for this particular cell, its value is dependent on itself and this variable, right? So ideally, we should update the first row of the matrix first and then the first column, right? I hope you got the gist of the problem. So what we are doing is we are starting from the starting in our matrix, and whenever we are encountering a 0 value, we are marking the first element in that row and the first element in that column as 0. So what we are doing is that we are keeping a variable c whose initial value will be 1, which will denote whether column 0 is marked or not, and then we will start iterating in our matrix, and then for every element we will check that if it is a 0, then whatever is the first element in its row and whatever is the first element in its column, we will mark it as 0. Then once we are done with all the elements, we will start from 1 comma 1, that is from this particular element till the end. And for every particular cell, we will check what is the value present in the first element of that row and first column of that row. If any of them is having the value as 0, then we will update this cell also to 0. After we are done till n comma m, then we'll update our first row, and after we are done updating the first row, then we'll check for the first column, right? So now let's code it out. So first of all, we'll create a variable c whose initial value will be 1, right? This will be used for marking column 0, right? Then what we'll do is we'll take the size of our matrix. So n will store the number of rows, so this will be matrix dot size, and m will store the number of columns, so it will be matrix of 0 dot size, right? Then we will start iterating in our matrix. So we will start from 0 comma 0. So I equals to 0, I less than n, I plus plus. Inside that we'll run a for loop of j from 0 till m, right? And then we'll check that if this particular cell is having its value as 0, then we need to mark its corresponding row and column, right? So for marking the row, we will do matrix of I of 0 equals to 0, right? And for the column, we'll do matrix of 0 of j equals to 0. But now here we need to keep this thing in mind that if our j is 0, then that means we need to mark column 0. So for that, we will use this c variable, right? So here we'll check that if our j is not equals to 0, then only you do this, right? Else you mark the variable c. So we'll make c as 0, right? So once we have marked all the rows and columns, now we will start from 1 comma 1 till n comma m, and we will update all the elements. So we'll run a loop. So I will start from 1 and will go till n and I plus plus, and then j will also start from 1 and it will go till m, right? Now what we need to check is that if the element in the current cell is not equals to 0, then that means we might need to update it to 0. So we will check its corresponding row and the column, right? So now what we'll do is we'll check that if matrix of I of 0 is equals to 0, then that means its row is marked, or matrix of 0 of j is equals to 0, then that means its column is marked. So if this is the case, then our current cell's value will also become 0, right? So after this loop, we will be done with updating our matrix from 1 comma 1 till n comma m, right? Now we need to update the first row, right? And when are you going to update the first row? If your first element in the first row is marked as 0, right? Only then you will update it, right? So you will check that if your matrix of 0 of 0 is equals to 0, then that means the very first element in your first row is denoting whether first row should be marked as 0 or not, right? So if it is equals to 0, then we'll update the first row. So we'll start a loop of I from 1 till m, right? Till m, and what we'll do, we'll simply do matrix of 0 of I equals to 0, right? Now when are you going to mark for the column, first column? So for denoting that whether column 0 is marked or not, we were using the c variable, right? And its initial value was 1, and whenever we wanted to mark it, we were updating c to 0. So here we'll check that if your c is now 0, then that means we need to make the elements of the first column as 0, right? So we'll do for int I equals to 0, I less than n, I plus plus, right? And we'll simply do matrix of I of 0 equals to 0, right? And we are doing this, all these operations in place inside the matrix vector, right? So we are not returning anything. So now let's run this. So now if you see that this particular for loop is running n cross m times, right? Then this loop is also running n cross m times. Then this loop is running m times, and this loop is running n times, right? So what is the complexity here? Big O of 2 into n into m because of the first two loops, plus m because of this loop, and plus n because of this loop, right? So the overall complexity of this code will be 2 into n into m. So let's submit this now. So it got accepted. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe our channel.